How do you leave a narcissist? And insofar as when you change your number, they will find you. They'll show up to your job. They'll show up to your work. They'll call you. They'll Venmo you $1. Mine reached out to me on LinkedIn because I had them blocked everywhere.
Okay, you know it's real when people are starting to contact through LinkedIn, though.
I've blocked you everywhere for a reason.
All right. Hi, guys. Welcome back to another episode of Unlicensed. My name is Jill, the host of Unlicensed, and hopefully you guys know what this podcast is all about. If this is your first time tuning in, this is the podcast where women write in anonymously each week, and me and my special guest of the week help offer that advice. Because I'm a 26-year-old who does not know what the hell I am doing with my life. This is why I have a bunch of fun guests joining us, and I am so excited for today's guest, guys. Today, Lisa Sunny is joining us. She is a certified life and relationship coach, founder of the Stronger Than Before, a trauma bond recovery course where you can break free from your trauma bond. She also is an author for a trauma bond recovery journal, Narcissistic Abuse Recovery, and Self-Love Reflection. And I know Lisa from TikTok. I've been following her for quite some time. I'm super excited for today's episode. Today, we're talking about breaking free from a trauma bond. We're talking about dealing with toxic partners. Lisa has a lot of expertise in this field. So welcome, Lisa. I'm so excited to have you here today.
Thanks so much. Me too. So exciting to share this wealth of knowledge that I regrettably have.
Regrettably. And yeah, you have a lot of it. So we'll get into it. Before we get into the advice, we obviously like to learn a little more about you. Our guests are like, who are these people that you're bringing in each week? So learning a little bit more about you and your story. You're very open about having been a survivor of narcissistic abuse and domestic assault. And I just want to learn a little more about your story and if your traumatic experience is basically why you do what you do today, helping people of all genders, of all walks of life, break free from these trauma bonds and being a victim from an abuser like this too.
Yeah, that's exactly what led me down this path to become a coach. It really all started with me sharing my story online, and then it sort of snowballed into people wanting to talk to me about my experience, and it kind of launched the business. My experience primarily has been being in a 10-year abusive relationship, and escaping that relationship was incredibly difficult. It's what made me learn about trauma bonding and narcissism and abuse in general. And I think as a person who talks frequently about narcissism, I think the word is overused in many ways, probably even by me. But I think one thing that I always like to point out is that when people say narcissist, they mean narcissistic. They don't necessarily mean narcissistic personality disorder, because it's a spectrum and there's traits. So people are calling out behaviors, and they're using this word to identify the traits that they see, which are commonly found in people who are narcissistic. So I don't get caught up in the label or the diagnosis. What matters is the behavior and the abuse. And that's what I teach people to focus on, and how to escape from these relationships. Because those trauma bonds, they hold you tight. It feels so hard to get out. It feels like impossible to get out, in fact.
And I'm sure we're going to get into what a trauma bond is and why a person that might be having some of these behaviors might want to trauma bond with someone, and why it is so difficult to break free from a trauma bond as well. I totally agree, though. I think the term narcissist, especially with social media, it is thrown out. Like, you have a bad first date and all of a sudden this person is a narcissist, which is not fair to that person who obviously may not be. What are some behaviors that a person with a narcissistic personality disorder may be showing for people, just so people stop throwing around the term? Because you don't want to label someone something that they aren't, especially with the negativity that is obviously thrown around this term as well.
Typically, it's around 3 specific areas, which is grandiosity, lack of accountability, and lack of empathy. Now, there's more to it, but those are the 3 things that we can kind of pinpoint and see in their actions and their behaviors. And so usually when you first start dating someone at the very beginning of a relationship, it's almost impossible to tell. Something that I've really come to grips with myself is you can't avoid dating a narcissist or meeting one, but you can avoid remaining in the relationship early on. But the way to do that is to start to notice that these relationships do not start with an ounce of grandiosity, or lack of empathy or lack of accountability. You don't see any of that off the bat, typically.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's exceptions, but typically you don't see it. What you do see is love bombing. That is like a heavy, and it's manipulation, right? Love bombing is not the honeymoon stage. There's a difference. It is very difficult to tell the difference. But narcissists typically will tell you that they've never met anyone like you and you've known them for 2 weeks. And they just, I know it's too soon to say I love you, but I'm just feeling it. And that's crazy to say so quickly. But people are like, oh, but I'm really feeling it. So this must be it. And why? Movies, right? We see these men and women on
Yep.
movies,
Yeah.
romance, and we start to think, oh, I've never felt this way before because this is true love. But actually, what's happening is a narcissist is mirroring you. They're doing small things like, being emotionally unavailable and seeing how you react to that. They're doing these little tests, testing your boundaries, testing your agreeableness, and your little reactions to that make them go, this person is a good person for me to be with. They don't have strong boundaries. They're very agreeable. Like, what do you feel like eating? I don't know. What do you feel like eating? They're like, perfect. She'll just go with whatever I want.
Oh, we're getting her right in. Yeah.
Those are the little things that make people feel so loved and feel so connected. Like it's so easy together. But ultimately, there's like an assessment happening from the narcissist to the victim. But that's my point. You can't tell. So I would say that the biggest sign there is in the speed with which it's moving. So if someone's telling you like, oh, you're my soulmate and I love you and I've never felt like this, and it's been like a month, I'm not saying the person's a narcissist, but I am saying that's a red flag. So I would be very cautious, and I would try to slow down if you're seeing them, 5 days a week at that point. Try to go 3. Like, just try to pull back a little, see their reactions. If they feel kind of possessive or they're snippy or emotional about it, those are also red flags to really pay attention to, because once you get past that and they feel safe with you, like you're a good victim, that's when you start to see the other traits that I was talking about.
And that is so scary, that the testing that you mentioned, the little things just to see if they can manipulate you down the road, where you, especially if you are a people pleaser like myself, you might just be like, oh, I'm being agreeable and it's fine. But really that person they're reading you all over and you don't even realize it. So those are some really good things to look out for, obviously. In terms of statistics and gender, I've read before that narcissism has a higher rate in men than women. Is that true? And obviously, let's go a little more into abuse as well. I think there is this narrative a lot of the time, and a lot of the time it's from media, that only men can be abusers. But we know that that's not the truth. We know that women can be abusers too. So let's talk about gender within toxic relationships and abuse, and specifically narcissism as well.
So I'll tell you what, there are statistics that, I'm going to air quote, prove that more men are narcissistic than women. And men seem to get very offended and upset by that. And I will say my viewpoint, because this is truly a subjective piece, because narcissism, the first thing you need to know is that people don't typically get diagnosed because you don't think there's anything wrong with you, which is sort of a trait of narcissism, right? Like, what do you mean? I'm superior. I'm amazing. I'm not a narcissist. So the statistics are already incorrect, starting with the first one, which is that 1% of people are narcissists. Experts actually believe that it's more like 10 to 15%. You include the undiagnosed people. So just for context, just to really make that sink in, call that 10 to 15 out of 100 people, which means we've all met and known multiple narcissists. Now, that said, of that number, is it more men? Is it more women? Studies show it's more men. And I believe it is more men. And I don't mean that to discount how many women are narcissistic and how awful narcissists are regardless of gender. But I actually think there's and it's probably way too big of a topic, but the reason why more men are narcissistic is because the qualities of narcissism are revered in men, where when the same qualities are displayed in women, we are sort of socialized out of that, right? Like, don't think too much of yourself. Don't be too confident. Don't be too aggressive. You're not that special. Tone it down. Be more quiet. Fit into the box.
Societal norms around that. Yeah.
We're socialized to not be that way. So whether the women are and have learned to reduce the traits, whether men just seem to get away with it more, I don't know. But it presents more obviously in men.
Wow. And that is so interesting. And even so, I didn't even think about this ever until our conversation right now. All the people that you probably have met, because they're not even being diagnosed, because like you said, they don't think that there's anything wrong with them, which is a scary thought, that obviously we could be walking around, and family members and friends and everything too is also good to know and good to learn this information.
Yep.
And within that, in terms of women who are abusers, you see more men being physically abusive compared to a woman. However, do you see more women who may be abusers in a relationship being more mentally abusive and emotionally abusive than physically for the most part?
Yes. So, speaking from statistics that I've read and researched, what I see more is that the women who are abusive are more likely to be emotionally and psychologically abusive than physically abusive. Not to say that women are not physically abusive. I've done a lot of research, and in fact, it's sort of a funny reason. I have a bias. I will openly admit, and it's horrible, but I have a bias that like men are the abusers and women are the victims because I think we were all raised to sort of think that. And so,
Yep.
in my role as an abuse educator, I want to be fair and inclusive and really understand. And so I went on this mission a few months ago of sort of like wanting to prove myself wrong. I want to see that like women are doing it too and that women are just as bad and it's actually a human issue, not a gendered issue. And even as I started to do research and I was kind of confirming my own bias, I was like, well, that's confirmation bias and it might just be like my Google browser knows what I want to read. So I've done such an amount of research on it that it's bananas. I've spent
Yeah.
crazy amount of time on it. But I think what I've come to terms with is that women are doing it and there's different motivations. But the reason why a lot of these bias exist that it's not women is because it's not studied. That's actually, in my view, one of the primary reasons that it appears as though women are not as abusive is because it's not studied. Now, there have been some studies. What I saw was that in most studies, women abuse men in reaction to abuse. And I want to just
Ah.
unpack that because there's just two parts to that. So sometimes I mean a woman is abused by a specific man and she becomes reactively abusive to that man. But I also mean that some women have seen abuse and experienced abuse, maybe an uncle, a brother, a father, a cousin, or witnessed it in their life, not even directly. And for that reason, they're like angry at men, which I would argue is righteous anger, but they have that sort of men are, they feel angry about it. So they sort of abuse men to sort of counteract, like, I'm not going to be abused. So I'm going to be strong, which is actually in those cases a bit abusive. Women who are like in prison for killing their husband, as an example, most, not all, most report that they had been abused for years prior to that. And so one could argue with reactive abuse, self defense, whatever you want to call it. But for the most part, women are reacting to abuse, but truly not in all cases. And I think noting that it's not in all cases is important because there are some men who are just genuinely in an abusive relationship. He did not provoke it. And that's another sort of stereotype of which men and women face in different ways. But like, so what did you do to make her so mad? What did you do to provoke it to a man? Now, women get the same sort of thing a bit differently, but nobody can provoke abuse. Nobody can do something to make another person abusive. Abuse is a choice. Abuse is a belief system. So it's an entitlement. It's this like I can treat people like that just because I am who I am and that's what I say and that's what I want. So it should be more studied. Some reports even show like women, want power and want control, but that's not it was a very small study, so one could argue, how accurate is it, but there's some weight to that because why do male abusers abuse? For power and control. So why wouldn't it be a likely assumption that women are abusing for similar reasons?
For the same reason. Yeah. That is so interesting. And it is actually very crazy to me that there's not more research on it. But I guess, like you mentioned, just how society already views abuse and they immediately just assume that it's men that are abusing, that also makes sense. So I think you're amazing for like doing the research, getting the facts behind that. I think that is a perfect segue for our first advice segment of the day. Guys, today we are talking about, again, toxic relationships, breaking trauma bonds, and getting out of a relationship that may not be good for you because of how you're either behaving in the relationship in terms of toxic behaviors or obviously that coming onto you as well. So this first person wrote in and they said, "Hi, I recently got out of a relationship with the narcissist a month ago and I'm struggling. There was constant manipulation, gaslighting, and blame on me 24/7. I've been trying to cope, but I'm mainly struggling because we trauma bonded. I need some advice on how to break a trauma bond post breakup. How can I do this? Is this even possible?" Okay, first getting into it, you kind of already mentioned some signs and you said it great, like the three things that kind of look out for when you obviously are dating someone who may be a narcissist. I also heard you mention that there's no way of really avoiding that. But do you see patterns sometimes of people? For example, I have a friend who's very open about the last few men that she's dated. there are a lot of, and maybe it was just a toxic person, but based on just like, if you Google signs of a narcissist and even those, a lot of things kind of happening with that. Is it possible that things from your childhood, if you grew up with a narcissistic parent, that you were easily able to get into a relationship with someone who's a narcissist? Or is it just because commonly it's assumed a lot of the times that narcissists are very charming and very confident on the outside? So a lot of the time people might just be attracted to that. Are there any patterns or anything about which kinds of people are getting into relationships with narcissists? Or is there really no research to support that at all?
No, there is tons of research to support that. People who were raised by a narcissist or someone who's narcissistic even are more likely to get into these kinds of relationships because narcissists kind of require you, including parents, right? They require you to have weak boundaries. They make it so, you get manipulated and shamed as a child, and you get sort of taught to not have boundaries, taught to please others, taught to sort of make sure that you are like managing the moods. There's a little bit of association with an anxious attachment style here, but if you're never sure how your narcissistic parent will be, right? Good, bad, because they're not always bad. That's the point. They're on that roller coaster. Sometimes they're nice, sometimes they're not. So when you're kind of on eggshells about your parent, you're used to people pleasing to make sure that your parent is happy because that's when everything's good in the house. And so you grow up and you are used to people pleasing. You're used to wanting to be seen and heard. And so you are highly susceptible because the narcissist will make you feel so seen and so heard at the beginning. And you are more likely to believe this soulmate connection and you fall into it. And the truth is, you are in it. You're in the bond, in that trauma bond, before you even understand what's happening. It's too late. I don't mean too late like you can never get out, but too late to go, okay, well, I'm just going to break up with the person. People
Right.
think, why didn't you leave at the first sign of, to this day, I find it very difficult to explain the words, but essentially there are 7 stages to a trauma bond. And in the beginning stages, it's the love and validation, the trust, the dependency.
Yeah.
You rely on them for approval and validation. You trust them, you depend on them. So once that's built, that's when that flip switches. And now you'll start to see gaslighting and manipulation and lying.
Oh my
But it's not
God.
like a switch and then bam, that's it. It's a slow introduction. And a trauma bond is formed in a relationship of intermittent positive reinforcement and abuse and devaluation. So people think like they're abusive. So how did you not leave? But the next day they beg you to forgive them. They justify it. And it makes sense because you trust them. So one bad move and you just leave. Nobody does that. People think they would do that, but they don't. Trust me.
Right.
People like to think that it could never happen to them. So they're sort of like, you must.
How are you not getting out of this? And then they're in it and they're like, oh shit, I actually see now what's happening.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's
yes.
easy to judge. It's easy to judge. And it starts with these small things. And it actually works like this positive reinforcement, as I said, mixed with the abuse. The positive reinforcement gets smaller and smaller, but there's a grooming process so that you are subconsciously learning to accept less and less. Everybody eats, right? So I always use this example of bread. I meet you, I give you a loaf of bread. The next day, a loaf of bread. The day after, a loaf of bread. Consistent. You're happy.
Yeah,
You're full,
yeah.
You're loving it. It's the best bread you've ever had. One day I give you half with no explanation. And you're just like, okay, well, that's today. Weird. Okay, the next day you get your full loaf again. But then 5 days later, you get like a quarter piece. And then eventually, and you just learn to get smaller pieces until you're sitting there with a
Wow.
plate of crumbs and you're starving. And then every time they're nice to you, you're like, oh, you get that big loaf of bread when all you've had is crumbs for 6 months. You're shoving it in your mouth. You're so excited to have it.
And you're like holding on to
You
that.
hold on to it tight. And that loaf now holds you 3 months when normally it would hold you a day. You've been groomed to accept less and less. So when they're nice, you hold on to that niceness and you're like, but I know that he or she is nice in there. But are they? No. The one thing I want to make a huge point of is the niceness exists to facilitate the bad.
I was going to say, when a narcissist is establishing that trauma bond with the person that they're dating, with the person that they're even married to, is their intention that they know down the line, oh, I'm going to switch it up, so I need to establish this? Is it conscious or a subconscious decision when they're doing that? This is where I get confused, because it seems like, I'm sure from the person being on the other side of it, I've trauma bonded with someone being like the victim of it. And on the other side, I'm like, oh, we're connecting. There's an emotional connection there in terms of just getting to know each other as humans. But I'm wondering if that person on the other side, whose intentions may not be as naive as mine in that moment, what's going through their heads?
So this has been studied a lot too, and truth be told, there are not a ton of definitive answers, but all the studies show that a narcissist will meet you and they genuinely idealize you, but they are creating this persona of you that you are.
Oh my God.
Just for the purposes of this, I'm going to say man and woman, but you're the most amazing woman they've ever met. And you are perfect and you're amazing and you're funny and you're kind and you're 10 out of 10 and you do all the things and I love you so much and you're greatest. And they believe that. But they've put you on such a pedestal. And I want to point out, you did not ask to be on this pedestal. You did not put yourself there. They put you there. And then
Yes, Lisa.
the tiniest thing happens. Like you said you were going to go out with your friend Stephanie, but actually it was Stephanie and Rachel. Now you're a liar. You're a liar. You've created a narcissistic injury. It could be that something simple. It could be something bigger, but it could be something so simple. A perceived dishonesty, a perceived slight against them. Now you are to be punished. And they don't want you to leave because they still want to have that power and control over you. And that's where it starts to get intentional. So they don't go into it like, I'm going to love bomb her and then I'm going to flip a switch. It's not typically so conscious, but it becomes conscious once you cause that injury. No, they will not let you go. They will lie, cheat, steal, gaslight, manipulate, does not matter, to keep you. And the specific reason is power and control.
Oh my gosh. That is terrifying though. Everything that you're saying right now, it's so fascinating because there are individuals out there, and just knowing that someone can prey on a person like that is really scary. And podcast is for women, and I know that women can be narcissists too, but I really want women to look out for this. But my next question too is, can you trauma bond with someone who is not a narcissist, and how may that look differently? Is that possible to trauma bond with someone who's not a narcissist, who's not a toxic person? And what's the difference, if there is any?
Yes, not a narcissist, but an abuser or a highly toxic person, yes, you can still be in a trauma bond. A trauma bond is not specific to narcissism. It's specific to abusive relationships. Not all narcissists are abusive. People get really crazy when I say that. I admit, in my viewpoint, most are, but there are some that are a bit lower on the spectrum and can manage it. And you also have social media creators like Mental Healness and Raw Motivations, Leon Walker, there's several, right, that are self-aware and trying to do better. But generally, when we speak about this, it's the ones who have no idea or just, don't care, the entitlement. But yeah, there doesn't have to be the presence of a narcissist to have a trauma bond. And how might it present differently? Not at all. It's exactly the same. Abusers and narcissists have a lot of similarities, and that's actually why the words seem to be being used synonymously when they're very much not the same thing. And actually, there's an author, Lundy Bancroft, who published a blog that was relatively short and just blew my mind about why it's so important to not call abusers narcissists. And the short answer is because narcissism, most studies show, not all, that narcissism is born of environment, meaning parenting. Who does all the parenting? Moms.
Oh my
Who are blaming
God.
moms for abusive men when every study shows that abusive men learn their behavior from abusive men, whether that's the porn industry, their father, their uncle, society, movies, general misogyny, the patriarchy. And so when you call your abuser a narcissist and they are not one, there's this underlying, like, his mom didn't raise him right.
Oh,
The
wow.
mom thing, right? It's not always the mom. And also, it, in many cases, could be the absence of a father. And people act like the single moms are, like, somehow raising abusers or people, because you see all these studies, like, children out of single mom homes are not doing that. How about we call them absent father homes? Let's just change the narrative, right? How about
I
we
love
call them
that. Yes,
children with
yes.
absent fathers do poorly. Let's not crap on the mother who's staying and holding it down and doing everything, right?
And doing everything for her child. Exactly.
But I say this, and of course I also opened this with, I probably do contribute to overusing the word. I would say for me, I am speaking about narcissists when I use the word. I am not speaking about abusers. I really make my best effort to label them properly, but it does obviously get grouped in quite a bit.
No, and that's great that you have that differentiation between the two, because it is really important to know. Mislabeling someone can be so dangerous down the line, especially when it comes to diagnosis and everything for future medical doctors and things too. So I love that you're doing that, and I think that's amazing. You kind of mentioned what is going through a victim's mind of why it's so hard to break trauma bond and why it's hard to get away from that person. But why does it feel so maybe good for them when they're initially trauma bonding? What is happening in the brain? What's happening in the nervous system when you're beginning to trauma bond with a narcissist, trauma bond with an abuser, that you're like, oh, this feels good, I'm feeling love? What is going on? What's the science behind it, if you know anything about this?
Yes. Funny, I actually hosted a webinar called The Science Behind a Trauma Bond. And
Perfect timing.
I literally three psychotherapists and one psychologist talking about the science behind it. But ultimately, in simple terms, there are chemicals in your body, which we all know, right?
Yeah.
Cortisol, serotonin, dopamine, they're all going. Dopamine's the one that you get that high from.
Yes.
Truly, the addiction aspect of it is that you are physically, not emotionally, physically addicted to the highs, the dopamine. And I've heard ridiculous advice, like you can get dopamine from lots of places. We get dopamine from social media. You feel like your abuser they can often be the source of your pain, but they're also the only person that can comfort you. They are the knife, they are the Band-Aid at the same time. So they hurt you, and the only person that can make you feel better is the person who hurt you. It's crazy, but that's what it is. So these feelings in the beginning, you're just on such a high. You feel seen and heard and loved and validated. You feel your authentic self. You feel like no one could ever make you feel this way. It is your soulmate. But then it flips and you're confused. And that confusion creates cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance took me 6 months to understand until one person, Dr. Carrie McAvoy, explained it to me in very simple terms. She's a clinical psychologist, but she explained it to me in a way that was just very palatable. And so,
love it. Yes, for me, I'm like, give me this way, please.
So Carrie said, it is the mental discomfort that you feel when you're holding two conflicting or opposing beliefs. Meaning, for simple terms, he is good, he is bad, right? He loves me, he hurts me. And it's confusing. So your brain is like, that doesn't make sense subconsciously. And so you feel this confusion, this discomfort. So to resolve that discomfort, it's all subconscious. To resolve it, you go, maybe he was having a bad day. Maybe he did it because his mom was mean to him when he was a child. Maybe he did it because his dad went to jail. Maybe he did it because of me. Maybe I did make him
putting the blame
angry.
on yourself then.
It's a subconscious way to just reduce that discomfort. The other way we experience cognitive dissonance is like, I am not a woman who would be in an abusive relationship, so I'm not in one.
Oh my God, yes.
Relationship, because I don't see myself that way. So I'm experiencing that confusion about my own beliefs and who I am and my values. I don't understand me specifically. I was a senior executive in the hospitality industry. I managed $30 million businesses. I was very successful. And anyone that knew me would unequivocally tell you that if a man said a damn word to me, I would slam him down. No way.
Right. You're not talking shit to Miss Lisa over here. No way.
And yet I would go home and be abused. But I didn't know it was abuse, first and foremost. People talk about why you stay. You stay because you don't know you're being abused, first and foremost. Nobody talks about that reason. There's financial, kids, family, love, blah, blah, blah. You didn't know is the number one reason, in my view, what I see. So I just didn't know. And as I started to be uncomfortable in the relationship and feel like there was a power imbalance and feel frustrated, he would constantly reinforce this idea that that's men, which PS made me hate men a little bit. But you have to realize that's not all men, right? And I've had relationships since that relationship, and I can unequivocally say that's not all men. I've had a relationship that just didn't work out, not abuse or toxic, just didn't work out, that he wasn't horrible. And I'm in one now, and he's incredible. Men have the ability to be great. They're not all abusers, but we feel we feel very traumatized out of these abusive relationships. And it can be like men who come out of it are like, I hate all women, and women who come out are, I hate all men. You can get past that, but it takes work. It does take work, and it takes trust, but self-trust.
Oh my gosh. Everything you said was so great, and I agree. I don't think so many women realize that they are being abused, because there's this, and I think media is an awful example of this as well. There's this narrative that abuse is only physical. So if you're not getting hit or beat or slammed down, you're not being abused, and people aren't taking into account the emotional abuse, mental abuse, all of the other factors that may be happening that you're not even aware to it. For your situation, was it you started to become educated on abuse and you're like, oh shit, I've been going through this? Was it somebody that spoke to you, a family friend, somebody? Or how did you finally realize that you were in an abusive relationship for 10 years?
It was my couples counselor. So my partner would show up late to most sessions. It was during COVID, so we were doing Zoom sessions. And so I would log in and he would be 5 minutes late. And it was in those minutes that she first said to me, "This is abuse." And I was physically abused, by the way. So I was actually like, I'm almost ashamed to admit, but we need to talk about it. I was a person who was physically abused as well as emotionally abused and still didn't recognize it as abuse because I had a reason. Like, it happened because he was drunk, not because he's abusive. I had an answer. I always had an answer for him. I was always defending him. But she said to me, "This is abuse." And it actually, it still didn't resonate until she said it to him. When she said it to him, that was a pivotal moment in my life that will never leave my brain. We were actually talking about sexual coercion within our relationship.
Yeah.
And it was like being presented to her, like, why doesn't she want to have sex with me? What's the problem? Something's wrong with her. Figure her out.
Like, what's wrong with her? And it's like, oh, that's not the issue here, buddy. Yeah.
She said, this is an abusive relationship, right? So she's having a natural trauma response where her body is physically shutting down. It's not that something's wrong with her. It's something's being done to her to make her not feel safe. So we need to build the emotional safety. And very shortly after, our therapist stopped seeing us due to the abuse because it's not safe to practice therapy when there's abuse. We downplayed the abuse quite a bit in order to maintain therapy. And then as things started to unfold, she was like, "Hey, you guys are telling me a lot of things." That she's an excellent therapist. But yeah, it was a tough realization. But when she said it to his face, I remember he was like, "Abuse, please." So ridiculous.
Wow.
And we're talking physical abuse. I experienced every kind of abuse except religious abuse, like financial, sexual, emotional, psychological, verbal, physical, all of it. I've experienced everything with this one person. It was horrendous. And even then I was like, okay, but maybe he can change and maybe he's only abusive because he does drugs. And but you learn, and I teach this now, abuse is a choice. Abuse is not a result of anything other than I decide I'm going to be abusive because I can. Period.
Yes. Thank you for saying that. That is so important. It is a choice. And I know you mentioned earlier, specifically for a lot of men, it's because of power and control. So thank you for sharing your story. I literally was getting goosebumps during that because the deflection of, oh, sure. And you're like, oh, no, but yes, but you haven't. It's like clicking for you in those moments. And oh my gosh, everything that you're doing, especially from everything that you've been through, is amazing. How does someone in a relationship with a narcissist, what studies have shown how a narcissist may break up with you, right? And then if you're someone that's lucky enough that you have the ability to break up with this person, get away from this person when you find that strength before they can even do it to you, what is a good way to break up with a narcissist? Because I know they're extremely manipulative. Mm-hmm. And if you've been in that relationship for a long time, I'm sure even if you're trying to break up with them, they can somehow switch it, right? What's a good way to break up with a narcissist, and how may they break up with you?
So essentially, yeah, you break up with them or they break up with you, but within those, there's little pieces that makes it very complicated. So I was discarded. But having said that, what I experienced was a discard and then constant hoovering, meaning trying to suck me back in. So like, you want me, you don't want me, but you are dating someone. I don't understand. Made no sense to me. But it's ultimately to maintain that power, right? If the new relationship doesn't work out, you still want the power over your old supply, so you have multiple things going on. But a narcissist may discard you because you hurt them in some way, and they may not be able to cope with how badly you've hurt them. Some can, though, right? There is no like all narcissists fill in the blank.
Right.
People hate this too, but they're humans. They just have traits that are similar, but it presents differently. So they might discard you because you've hurt them. They might discard you because they met someone who's just their perception of better than you. And when I say that, they're not better than you. They are in the idealized state that you used to be in. When they discard you, typically, not always, but typically, you have started to catch on. You have started to call them out. You've started to push back. You've started to be like, hey, this isn't okay. Hey, I don't like this. Pissing them off by doing that, right? You're not being compliant, blindly compliant, which is what they demand and expect. And so you're causing injuries to them by that, so they will discard you. Some will just not discard you and they will just torture you forever. And so in those cases, how do you leave a narcissist? And it's difficult. And I'm going to speak first from the perspective of no children. So if you do not share children, the best thing you can do, although I will admit the hardest thing you could possibly do, is leave with no communication. Do not explain, leave, ghost, change your number, walk out the door, never to be seen again. But in truth, how often is that logistically possible? Rarely, but that's the best way to do it. So the other way is end it, be clear, move out, whatever you need to do, change your number, get out of there, and do your very best to remain no contact. Don't beat yourself up if you break no contact, because my God, do I know how hard it is, but no contact is the easiest way, and don't take that to mean easy, just easiest. However, they don't make it easy insofar as when you change your number, they will find you. They'll show up to your job. They'll show up to your work. They'll call you. They'll Venmo you $1 just to put a message in. They'll call your mother. They'll tell your friends. I mean, I've seen the most outrageous things, and not rarely. I mean, frequently, I see the most insane attempts to mine reached out to me on LinkedIn because I had them blocked everywhere.
Okay, it's real when people are starting to contact through LinkedIn, though.
Like, we need to talk. Okay. I've blocked you everywhere for a reason, but so that makes it really challenging. So when I say go no contact, I really understand the layers of what makes that so difficult, because they're typically, when they're in that stage, you've broken up with them. Sometimes they'll walk away because you've hurt them. Rarely, but more often than not, they will either come at you and devalue you and tell you you're trash and you're garbage and they're going to love you, or they'll hoover you and say, please, I'll promise change. I'll stop drinking. I'll go to therapy. I swear. Or the worst, both. And you're confused and it doesn't make sense. And you're still living in that cognitive dissonance. And you're in a trauma bond. So you want to believe them. You're still dependent on them for that dopamine, right? But when you share children, people will tell you can't go no contact. Now, I'm living proof that's not true. But it's much more
yes.
It is difficult because from always listen to your lawyer, but from a legal perspective, just like stonewalling your co-parent can look really bad. So you do need other things to sort of change that. You can manage the communication if you have to. And then there's some communication methods that you can use. My personal favorite is the BIF method. So when you have to communicate, it's brief, it's informative, it's firm, and it's friendly. Again, specifically talking about people who are co-parenting, because if you're not, there's no method except shush. That's it. No talking. There's also this thing called the JADE method, which is don't justify, don't argue, don't defend, don't explain. So when you're communicating and they're accusing you, asking you, demanding something of you, being awful to you, answer a question if it needs to be answered, but you can just ignore everything else. Just don't even respond. People ask me all the time, how do you do that? You got to turn down your caring, which is the hard part.
Oh, yeah, that's rough. That's rough. That's hard. But yeah, these are awesome methods, especially for people who might be in, a marriage, something other than just like boyfriend and girlfriend, or in some sort of monogamous relationship, or even just like a hookup that's kind of turning into this. But those are really good ways to have that after. So last words of advice for this person. How can this person begin to break their trauma bond post breakup? They're not with this person anymore. And obviously, like you said, the best way after that is no contact, but that can be difficult. In terms of just their own self-esteem, self-confidence, building that up after a trauma bond, what are some ways they can begin to do that?
So I personally have kind of a 3-step method, which I think, to be funny, it oversimplifies what needs to be done. These are 3 big steps, but the first step is education. And this is where you're building knowledge and clarity, because truth be told, right, we talked a lot about confusion and cognitive dissonance. You are confused. You don't know that it's abuse. And speaking to what you said, when it's not physical abuse, because narcissism is more defined by psychological abuse. So it's more often than not physical abuse. You have to start understanding like, oh, what's gaslighting? I've never heard that word before. Oh, I know what manipulation means, but oh, that's manipulation. Or control versus coercive control, which is way more subtle. So you start to learn the things, and then you're like, hey, this person is doing these things to me. It starts to give that clarity. So what kind of person does these tactics that are abuse tactics? An abuser. But you have to get yourself there mentally. You can't just say it and then the person believes it. You have to coach yourself. Therapy, coaching is also great in terms of helping. But again, if you don't know you're being abused, it's hard. So step one is gaining that clarity. Step two, you need to start to get back into your own inner child a little bit. You need to start doing the work of like what got you here, never from a place of judgment, but from a place of understanding. So what made you the kind of person that's in an abusive relationship? The people pleasing, the lack of boundaries, the really high agreeableness, the loyalty part. Where did that come from? And can we unlearn some of that? Can we grieve the relationship? Because people act like you can't grieve. You know, if he was abusive, who cares, girl? Move on. You feel like you're going to die in a trauma bond. Like your life is ending. I was on the bathroom floor crying into a pillow, Googling, can you die from crying? Like a grown person who absolutely knows you can't die from crying. I'm like, so you have to really grieve that and put it together and move past it. Step three is build a future. You need to build this future that does not include them. Because we don't like, what am I going to do without him? What are you going to do without him? Answer the question. Where are you going to live? How are you going to support yourself? What are you going to do with your kids? Are you married? Do you need to get a divorce? You know, are you financially independent? Are you not? Do you have the right support system? Do you have friends and family? Are they the right friends and family, right? You know, the well-intentioned moms and sisters that totally do the opposite of
Yeah, they're the ones that are telling you to get over it, and you're like, oh my God, I'm grieving. Please do not.
yeah,
Yes.
please stop this. So you have to build the right support system, but that first starts with what kind of support do you need, right? Like for me, I needed financial support more than I needed anything else. And I know that for some people, they're like, great, that's what I need, and nobody can do that for me. I get it, but at least you know where the issues are. The last piece of this building a future is self-love, which is a huge part, and in my view, lifelong. But you got to do that beginning work of like, I forgive myself for being in this relationship because I didn't know then what I know now, but our brains don't remember what it was like to not know what a trauma bond was and cognitive dissonance and all this. So then through your healing, you actually feel more stupid because you start to know things and you're like, how did I not see this? You didn't know.
You did
didn't
not know.
That's it. So give yourself that grace, start to learn about self-worth. It's what made me write my second book because as I built this platform around the trauma bond recovery course and the journal, like then what? You know, and my trauma bond recovery journal ends with self-love, but you're not learning it in a chapter. So I wrote a second journal that focuses on that rebuilding after a trauma bond to really focus on that self-worth piece. Like where does it come from? Where did you learn that you weren't worthy? Unlearn that. So there's so much work to be done, but it's 3 steps. Education, learn about yourself, build a future.
Yes, that is so amazing. I love that you just broke it down like that and asking the why of how I got here, the where I want to go afterwards. That is amazing. And for you guys listening, you heard it from Lisa today. We're going to jump into our second advice segment again about toxic relationships. Person wrote in and they said, "Hi, I'm currently in an extremely toxic relationship and I don't know why I can't seem to just break up with this guy. We fight constantly. He constantly points out my flaws. He never takes accountability. He's extremely controlling of what I wear and who I hang out with, and he never asks about me anymore. It's all about him. Why am I struggling to leave, and how can I begin to put myself first?" For when you're first starting to date someone and you're noticing these toxic traits, do you give the advice of just leave before you get any more invested, before you get to know this person anymore? What do you think about that? Because I think so many women, especially, they might meet a person and a lot of the time it might be someone that they liked for a while and they're idealizing this version of them. And then they start to date them and then they're seeing these really toxic traits that they know in their gut, their intuition's telling me, I don't like how I'm feeling, I don't like how I'm being treated. But you might stay for a variety of different reasons. Maybe you don't want to be alone. Maybe you're just settling. Maybe you're being abused and you don't even realize it for some parts of your life. Is your advice just to get the hell out before you get even more invested? But also on the other side of that, we know how hard it can be to get out of these relationships sometimes. So what would you say to that?
So I never tell people to get out quickly because they would if they could. So I'm going to give anyone who would write a question like that the benefit of the doubt that if she had the emotional capacity to leave, she would. She's not in a toxic relationship. She's in an abusive relationship. And those words are unequivocally not synonymous. I feel very strongly about that. And I hear a trauma bond. So it's not always the reason we can't leave, for clarity. Like, that's not always why people stay. There are other reasons. Like, you know what I will ask people sometimes, if I gave you $50,000, would you leave tomorrow? If people are like, maybe, or like, yeah, but I might go back, trauma bond. If I said, I'll give you $50,000, would you leave? And you're like, hell yes, I hate this man. Money is stopping you, right? Could be children, religious values, so many reasons. But this commenter or this question strikes me as a trauma bond, because what she's saying is, he's bad for me. I know he's bad for me, and I feel so stuck, and I love him, but I can't leave, but I need to leave. And oh, like, that's what I hear. That's a trauma bond. That's what that sounds like. And to call it toxic is an incredible downplay, controlling. What she's described there is abusive, manipulative, horrendous behavior. And she feels stuck. She doesn't feel, I can hear in the question, she does not have free will to leave. If she leaves, what would happen? You know, and I know she can't answer the question right here, but he will maybe devalue her or hoover her back, right? He wouldn't let her go. He wouldn't make it easy for her to go. So she would do well to learn about abusive relationships and stop calling it toxic first and foremost, right? People ask me a lot, like, what's the difference? Because, and I get the reasoning behind the question, right? Is it toxic or abusive? And my first question is, why does that matter? Because I know the answer. It was the same as me. In almost all cases, it's because you think if they're toxic, they can change, and if they're abusive, they can't.
Oh, Lisa, you're blowing my mind right now.
Healthy people, toxic people, abusive people, change is very difficult for people. You don't see a lot of change in people because it's really, as we talked about earlier, it's a belief system. These are things that you learn as a child that become part of your, like, being entitled. That becomes part of your traits. Do character traits? Talk to any mental health professional who's a licensed professional, and they're going to tell you it's very difficult. So even if you decide, I want to be a comedian, and you're not funny, how do you just be funny? That's very difficult, right? So certain traits are just not as easily learned. It's difficult to unlearn and relearn and so on. So change is difficult for anyone. Now you put in this factor of, like, abusers benefit from their abusive behavior. So, like, why would they change? Take it down to toxic people. It's not necessarily even that it benefits them, but they don't know any other way. And people think, like, oh, go to therapy. And a lot of people in toxic relationships will be like, well, let's go to couples counseling. That's the worst place to go, because relationship problems are more often than not two people with individual problems slamming them together. So the best solution is 2 individual therapy sessions happening.
Yeah.
Each of you
That's
go
good advice right there. Yes, yes, yes.
But typically, it's not me, it's you. So then they don't go, right? They won't actually do the therapy. But toxic people often, most often, in fact, don't change. And even when they do try, it's difficult and the change is not what we expect. So if you are, you know, relatively speaking, healthy in a relationship with someone who is, relatively speaking, toxic, you're always going to have challenges until the toxic person just takes accountability. And that's the trickiest part, because what is accountability? We both have problems. We both have communication issues. Like, bleh, right?
Accountability. I'm getting fucking mad hearing that. Yes.
Accountability is, I have a problem. Now, in your head, you might think, yeah, so do you. It's the control of not saying that, right? The accountability.
Yes.
I'm just going to own my part, and I'm going to hope that you own yours too. And if you don't, I can make a decision. But accountability isn't, I know I was bad, but, like, you too.
Oh my God. That is my, I can't even deal with that.
Makes
Yes.
me so mad.
Yes.
It literally sends me into a spiral of rage. So accountability is that. Change is self-motivated. You can't convince someone to change. You can't have children, money, family, sex. Nothing will make a person change except a willingness to do so and full accountability. How much work do you want to put into changing someone? Change takes years, plural.
Yes.
So many years.
Yes.
An undetermined number of years. Are you willing to be with this toxic person who's nice to you sometimes?
Yep.
And invest 7 years hoping that they get better in therapy and they only get like 15% better?
Exactly. They don't even really want to change. They're just doing it because they may not want to lose you. They really need to want that for themselves to truly be this person that you want them to be at the end of the day. It can't just be to appease you for a few months and then you stay, because you're just going to keep going through the cycle.
Yeah, it has to be for them. And that's what that really looks like. And honestly, on that note, that person I was talking about, mental healness, he's a self-aware narcissist, mental healness across all platforms. He has committed to a lifetime of therapy. He will be in therapy for the rest of his life. He's like 36 years old, therapy till he's dead, period. He knows that. He's committed to that. That's his promise to his family. And that's where you would have a better understanding, because he decided to go. He didn't do it for anyone. His wife didn't tell him to do it. He chose it. And he chooses it every time he walks into his therapist's office. So that's what it takes forever. And so are people willing to put in that forever? And are you seeing the results, right? Because again, accountability is, I am abusive. Not like, oh, no, I have problems. No, you're abusive. Say the words. Say the tactics. You know what? I was gaslighting you. I was manipulating you. That's what it looks like, the real full picture. Where people get messed up is when the abuser says, I know, okay, I was abusive. I'll go to therapy. And they go to like 2 sessions and say it didn't work.
Never go again. Yeah.
Or they go for 6 weeks or whatever. But you get sucked in. You need to have this full scope of they're doing the things, and never give them the list of things to do. So like this girl who's in a toxic relationship, she might be thinking he needs therapy. And I'm making this up, but anger management and to stop drinking. So she'll say to him, therapy, stop drinking, and anger management. And now he's got a checklist, and he'll go check, check, check. And therapy didn't work, and anger management's stupid. And I only drink on the weekends now. I drink less. So what's your effing problem?
Oh, it's dangerous. That's
I
dangerous.
did the things you asked me for. Nothing's ever good enough for you. And you're like, oh my God, he did do the things. It's just, it's so insidious. It's so covert. Even the toxic traits, it's so brutal to get out of, because you are living on that hope. Hope is the worst part of these whole relationships, because you hope they change. You pray they change. There is no action in hope or prayer. None.
Oh my gosh. Is the hope also, does that also come into play when, if you leave a relationship with a toxic person and you begin to miss them, right? I think most people have maybe dated, and hopefully not everybody, but I've dated some toxic people, and I find myself, I'm like, oh, fuck it, I'm good. And then maybe a few months later, I'm like, oh, I kind of miss that person, like desiring to be with them again. Is that where that hope comes into play as well? Like, oh, maybe we'll be together in the future and they've changed and blah, blah, blah. In reality, half the time, no, they have not changed. They are still the same person. It might take them, like you said, years to become that better version of themselves. But how does hope play into that? That desiring of wanting to be with that person again.
When you start missing them, it's that hope of like, I wonder if I could have made it work, and I hope that they change, and I hope that they could be better, and maybe so. But you start reminiscing, and to a degree, it could be euphoric recall. But it's that also, speaking of overused phrases, it's not always that. Euphoric recall is just really like a process in your brain where you can only remember the good. Missing someone and focusing on some of the good isn't necessarily euphoric recall, but we do that because the bad stuff is painful. Like, it's kind of that simple. You're not remembering the bad because it hurts. So you start to remember the good. I could sit here and recall pleasant memories with my ex. I can do that. And I'm actually at a place where I can do that without getting emotional at all. But you kind of need to remember, when you're feeling yourself missing them, are you missing them? Or are you missing the relationship, having a relationship?
Wow.
Or are you missing the person they pretended to be? Because that person's not real. You're missing a mirage. Now, the feeling is the same, but you can help yourself by saying, I don't miss them. I miss who I thought they were. Say that. Don't say I miss them. Stop talking to yourself like that. Don't say, but I love them. I am trauma bonded.
That wasn't them.
And I'm trying to work on this. Tell yourself things in language that is more accurate, right? Trauma bonds are not love. They mimic love. You think it's love, but it's not.
Oh my gosh, Lisa, I am obsessed with you. I am like nodding aggressively, learning so much. Last words of advice, last thing for this person who is trying to get out of this relationship. And like you said, it's not going to be easy. It's not like you're just going to wake up one morning, especially for this person that we said, there's a difference. This is someone who's being abused and not just in a toxic relationship. What are some steps that this person can take to get out of this relationship, focus on themselves, the 3 steps that we mentioned earlier, and then to hopefully finding a partner one day that does not treat them like this and is healthy as well? What are some first steps they can do just to start to see themselves even in a new light so they know that they don't deserve this?
I strongly recommend therapy to anyone, so even if you're in a relationship and you're just feeling unhappy with it, you may not recognize it's abuse or toxic, but you're just feeling like something's wrong, don't go to couples counseling. Go to individual therapy and try to work that out. That said, therapy is expensive, and I fully appreciate that not everyone has access to that. And so in that case, I would suggest, this is going to sound crazy, but like YouTube, TikTok are two of the best places that you can go for free content. And you just like hashtag toxic relationships, hashtag abusive relationships. See what comes up. Start getting, involved in watching videos and watching content on self-love. Even if you're not having the language to know that it's toxic or abusive, start looking at yourself and looking at like why you're here. Why are you unhappy and staying? Because you don't need to know what a trauma bond is or abuse or toxic. Ask your therapist or ask Google why you are staying in a relationship where you're unhappy, and start to research that on your own, because that really is the education that we were talking about, right? You need to learn what got you here. That will help you build the language to know that you're in an abusive relationship.
That is great advice. Lisa, you are amazing. And like you said, TikTok is a great first resource for people if you can't afford therapy, if you don't have insurance to go to therapy. I'm lucky enough to have that, but I know a lot of people, a lot of my friends aren't. So you're a perfect example of someone that people can find for free as well. Please plug your social media, your website, your course, so people listening in today that might be going through these issues or know someone that's going through these issues can begin to learn about themselves and grow from this as well. Where are you at, Lisa? Where can the people find you?
Great. Well, I am Lisa Sonni, which is Sonni if you're Googling me, but I am stronger than before across all platforms. So TikTok is my sort of biggest or primary. I'm on YouTube, I'm on Instagram, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Pinterest, I'm everywhere. So that's where you can watch some of my content. And then on my website, which is strongerthanbefore.ca, and that is where you can find access to the Trauma Bond Recovery course, which is a 12-week self-paced course to take you through 12 weeks of the knowledge, which is fundamentally the 3 steps that I talked about, but it takes you through 12 weeks of learning those things piece by piece to help you be able to do it. And it's $59, and it's actually designed for people who can't afford therapy. I also have people use it that are talking to coaches or therapists about the course and doing it in conjunction with. You can also get my books on Amazon, which is the Trauma Bond Recovery Journal and Rebuilding After a Trauma Bond, a Self-Love Journal.
Amazing. Well, guys, you know where to find Lisa. Please go check her out. I promise you will not be disappointed. I know if you're nodding as aggressively as I am during this episode today, you need to find her immediately. And as always, you know where to find Unlicensed on all of our streaming platforms to listen to more guests like Lisa. We are on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, everywhere, and of course, social media. My Instagram, unlicensed_advice, and then my TikTok, unlicensed_advice. If you want your story or situation shared on this podcast and to be answered by myself and wonderful guests, head to that link in bio Google form, fill it out. Remember, we keep it all anonymous, so nobody's gonna know it's you. Unless you're using names. And we'll take out the names if it's getting specific. Vent your heart out. We got you. As always, guys, I love you. See you next week.
How do you leave